port city in the Deep South. And if you go down Dolphin Street, Mobile's old immigrant and mercantile block where my grandparents still have a store there, they've been long deceased, and then another family member runs it, you'll see stores that were run by Lebanese, Cubans, Greeks, Poles. So I think that's the story that gradually will get out to the rest of the country, and that is that the South and the Gulf Coast in particular, apart from stories of race relations, hurricanes, Mardi Gras, baseball players, is one of tremendous cultural diversity too. Much more subtle than in the Northeast, but it's still there, only to be listened. Look at the kids who've come through this wonderful bus today. Varying backgrounds, different nationalities. This is quietly diverse, but it's there.
Roy Hoffman, author of Back Home, Journeys Through Mobile. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Philosophy professor A.C. Grayling examines the morality of Allied air attacks on civilians during World War II in his new book, Among the Dead Cities. Next, he's joined by Christopher Hitchens, author of Love, Poverty, and War, to debate whether the targeting of civilians can be justified at times of war. This is 2 hours.
Well, good evening.
Does
this work?
Make sure they do.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Goethe Institute Washington, the German Cultural Center. I'm Heribert Ustrin, the director of the Goethe Institute Washington. Thank you for coming to this evening's event. A special welcome to our guests, A.C. Grayling and Christopher Hitchens, who will debate Professor Grayling's new book, Among the Dead Cities, and his deliberations on the moral legacy of Allied area bombings in World War II. Why this debate in a German cultural institute? I have to admit that I had doubts at first that this would be an appropriate venue for this debate. And there were two reasons for my doubts. First, in an emotional reaction, I felt shame. Because, you see, I think that a person or a group of persons who committed atrocious crimes and caused unimaginable suffering to so many people should not dwell on their own suffering. Secondly, some people might misuse the arguments and conclusions in Professor Grayling's book, as he himself is very much aware of. And in this context, some other people might be suspicious of our motivation for having this event here. Please let me be very clear about this. Nothing in Professor Grayling's book can change the historical evaluation of and the judgment on what Germany and Germans did during the Third Reich. Modern Germany will have to live for a long time with its past. However, never forgetting the history of the last century, we, and especially we at the Goethe Institute, are committed to work for a common future, hoping that certain things will never happen again. To achieve this, we want to learn from the past. And I hope tonight's debate will be one opportunity to think about what the moral questions raised in Professor Grayling's book mean for all of us today. I would like to thank Walker and Company and the Politics and Prose bookstore for suggesting this event and their cooperation in organizing it. Thank you for your attention, and now please welcome George Gibson with Walker and Company.
Save it for them. My name is George Gibson, and I am the publisher of Walker and Company, a book publisher in New York City. And I also want to start out by thanking Heribert and the Goethe Institute and the wonderful local bookstore you have here in Washington, D.C., Politics and Prose, for sponsoring and hosting this event. We at Walker and Company have the honor this month of publishing A.C. Grayling's new book, Among the Dead Cities. We have not, and I should add at this point to be fair to all of you, but I should add the word yet. We have not yet had the honor of ever publishing Christopher Hitchens. But things in publishing are circular, and one never knows. Though I, like you, no doubt, have had the pleasure of reading him for many, many years. What distinguishes Anthony Grayling, from me anyway, is his desire and ability to make philosophy and the deep and often open-ended questions it raises both accessible to ordinary people and relevant to their daily lives. I don't know how this evening is going to go, but I do know that at some point during this conversation, the Allied bombing of civilians in World War II, more than 60 years ago, is going to be connected to our world today. Anthony Grayling is a professor of philosophy at Birkbeck College at the University of London. He is the author of many other books, including a biography of the great French mathematician and philosopher René Descartes, which Walker will publish this October. He is a fellow of the World Economic Forum, and he contributes regularly to a number of publications, including The Economist, The Financial Times, and The Observer. And he is also a member of a regular panel on the BBC World International on international affairs. Christopher Hitchens, I suspect, needs little introduction to the people in this room. A prolific author, journalist, and critic, he is famously unafraid to have a strong opinion and equally unafraid to change that opinion over time. When we created a short list of people we wanted to approach to have a dialogue with Anthony, he was at the very top of the list, and we're thrilled that he accepted. You therefore have before you two of the most engaging and interesting minds in the world today, and I will now get out of their way and let you hear them. But before I do, let me just say they will each speak for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, after which I'm sure they'll interact with each other, and then we'll take questions from the audience. After that, books will be available outside, and I suspect that if you wanted to procure a signature or an inscription, you could probably do so if that appealed to you. Could I also ask that you check to see that all your cell phones are turned off and that you refrain from taking photographs while they are speaking? And now, without further ado, Anthony Grayling and then Christopher Hitchens. I think that's the order, isn't it not?
Thank you,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you very much indeed, George, and thank you so much to the Goethe Institute for hosting this. I must begin by saying straight away, picking up a point that Dr. Ustrin made there about the delicate aspect of this, particularly in a setting like this. From the Allied point of view, that is from the point of view of the Western Allies, the United Kingdom and the United States, the Second World War was a just war, a war that had to be fought because it was being fought against aggressors. And there were aggressors who, and was known at the time and more fully known afterwards, perpetrated some horrendous atrocities, some horrendous crimes against humanity. And one of the greatest crimes that the Western Allies could have committed during the course of the war would have been to lose it. And that's a point that I'm very alive to, and it's one that we have to bear in mind when we prescind from the larger picture of the war and look just at our own consciences on the Allied side of the struggle, to ask ourselves whether everything that we did in it passes muster from the moral point of view. Is it really the case that all the endeavours that we made, all the decisions that we made, all the actions we took in the course of that war are unquestionably good ones from the point of view of the overall aim of the war? Now, I should just say a little bit about how I came to write the book, because it explains, in a way, the conclusion that the book comes to at the end. And when I was a very small boy, what I wanted to be was a Spitfire pilot in the Battle of Britain. This was a very common ambition on the part of small boys in the decade or two after the Second World War. And there were some difficulties, like time travel and better eyesight and things like that, that prevented me from fulfilling this ambition. So I did the next best thing, which was to read as much as I possibly could about the air war. First, of course, about the Battle of Britain itself, and then, as time went by, I read more and more about the bombing war. And almost immediately noted that there was a tone of doubt, a tone of uncertainty in the historical accounts given. almost every historian of the bomber war found it necessary to provide justifications for one important aspect of it, namely that aspect of it which involved area bombing of urban centres, the deliberate and systematic targeting of thousands of tons of bombs, indeed hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs, on civilian populations. And as soon as I noticed that there was this equivocation, it felt to me as though here was something that had been too little discussed in a way, too much left to the concluding chapters of these histories. And then I came across a remark in one of them which said, this question whether it was right or wrong to conduct area bombing as opposed to tactical bombing, specific bombing of genuine industrial military targets, is a question which we must leave to the moral philosophers. And I thought, well, the day will come when I'll try to take up that challenge, and that's what I've done in this book. And in order to take up that challenge, and in order to be scrupulously fair to all sides of the argument about this, I felt it necessary to talk about the history of the area bombing campaigns, which I've done in the book. Also to talk about the intentions and the knowledge on the part of people who conducted it, and that meant looking at the discussion about bombing as a weapon of war in the decades before the Second World War. And I mean, just to give you an example, one astonishing thing was that in 1899 at a Hague international conference in The Hague on armaments and peace, it was decided by the international community present there to outlaw throwing hand grenades out of balloons. This is before there were aeroplanes. Already it was clear, coming up on the horizon, that developments in technology were introducing potential weapons and potential strategies of war that could be tremendously destructive. And so as early as that, as early as the late 19th century, this first endeavour was made. And all during the decades before the Second World War, those 40 crucial years, there were repeated debates about bombing and the experience of bombing. For example, in the First World War, the Germans launched a bombing campaign against the United Kingdom. They sent over Zeppelins and big airships and Gotha bombers, these gigantic bombing aircraft. They killed about 1,500 people, mainly as a result of inaccurate navigation, inaccurate bombing. They thought they were bombing a munitions factory in Liverpool, and actually they were bombing a residential district in Folkestone. And the result in the minds of people in England itself was to be horrified at the prospect of bigger bombers and more of them with more bombs on them, and the devastating effect that would have on civilization. Indeed, so great was the fear, at least on the part of civilian minds, that in the peace conferences in Geneva during the 1920s and early 1930s, not only was an endeavour made to ban bombing, to outlaw bombing in war, but indeed it was at one point mooted that flight, that aeroplanes should be banned, on the grounds that if there was one, somebody would throw a bomb out of it. Well, that didn't persuade anybody, largely because the militaries at the time had already grasped the potential of bombing. After all, the British had been using it very effectively in Iraq all during the 1920s to police the recalcitrant tribesmen there. And the person who was in command of that bombing endeavour in Iraq was a man called Arthur Harris. And Arthur Harris was of that school of thought, initiated by Douhet and others, that bombing was an extremely potent weapon which could bring a war to an end very swiftly because it would terrorize a civilian population into persuading its own government to give up the struggle. There were quite different thoughts about bombing and what bombing was for and should be for here in the United States of America. Prior to the Second World War, the United States Army Air Force had drew up plans for how it would conduct a bombing campaign if it got involved in a struggle in Europe. And they decided that with a smaller force and smaller bombers, targeting their endeavours at genuine bottlenecks in transport, in the production of military equipment and aircraft, and very, very crucially, oil supplies, that they would be able to strangle the enemy war effort. And as it turned out, and as the bombing surveys found at the end of the Second World War, that was exactly right. One of the great contributions to winning the war in Europe was made by the United States Army Air Force, the mighty 8th based in England and the 15th based in Italy, most of whose endeavours were aimed at these bottleneck targets. And for proof, if one needed it, one has only to think of the day on which the Soviet army crossed the Vistula River heading westwards towards Berlin. They were met by no fewer than 12,000 panzers waiting on the Baranov bridgehead. these highly maneuverable, fast tanks which packed a lot of punch and which were very well manned, 12,000 of them waiting on the Baranoff bridgehead. Not one of them could move because they didn't have any petrol. The fuel supplies had been severely interdicted mainly by American bombing in the period beforehand. Now, when the war seemed imminent, when people realized that it was about to break over the heads of people in Europe, and this was from the mid-1930s onwards, the anxiety about the effect of bombing was so great that all the major governments of Europe put into place plans for how they would deal with it. In London, for example, 60,000 additional hospital beds were provided. Something like 1 million, enough timber to make 1 million coffins was set aside. And in one of those tremendous acts of futility that all bureaucracies go in for, an extra 5 million death certificates were issued to local authorities. And this is a measure, in a way, of what the anxiety was, because, of course, people thought that on the very first day of war, a mighty fleet would come across the Channel and would bomb London flat, and there would be millions of people trying to stream into the countryside, and there would be chaos and there would be terror. And as it happened, actually, mere minutes after Neville Chamberlain announced that the United Kingdom was at war with Germany, the air raid alarms went off in London because a solitary French pilot had forgotten to file his flight plan on the way across the Channel. But that, too, was a measure of the anxiety that people felt about it. And against the background of that anxiety, Neville Chamberlain twice in the House of Commons, once before the war began, and once in the so-called phony war period between the actual outbreak of war and the 10th of May when the Germans attacked in the West, had twice said in the House of Commons, His Majesty's government will never bomb civilians during the course of this war. He believed, on the authority of his advisers, that it was against international law because it was felt by Chamberlain's government, as it was felt here in the United States of America, that the discussions that had been held in the preceding decades in effect amounted to something close to customary international law, and that it would be a crime in that law to bomb civilian targets. Of course, actually, the motivation for Chamberlain saying what he did about not bombing civilian targets was that Britain was very underprepared for the war and terrified that a great assault against the cities of the United Kingdom would be mounted by Germany. And so he was trying to persuade the Germans not to do it by saying that he wouldn't do it. So that was an important part of the motivation. But it was sincere enough for Bomber Command to be under very strict instructions that its aircraft should not cross the coast of continental Europe in case a bomb fell out of an airplane and onto a civilian. So the Bomber Command wasn't even allowed to cross the coast before the attack in the West on the 10th of May 1940. And after that attack, and right the way up until February 1942, and despite the Blitz, about which the certain things would be said, because in fact it wasn't itself a genuine area bombing campaign, it was an attempt to paralyze the financial and administrative districts of London and to paralyze the industrial cities like Coventry and dock cities like Plymouth and so on. But even despite that, Bomber Command was under orders not to target civilian populations deliberately until February 1942. But increasingly, in the early years of the war, there was more and more acceptance of what we now call collateral damage. The fact that if you're attacking a military facility or a factory in a city, your bombs are going to fall on the people who live nearby. And the anxiety about doing that early in the war dissipated, as the morning mist does, with the sun coming up, so that by the time the infamous directive of 14th February 1942 was sent to Bomber Command saying, your primary target from now on will be the morale of the enemy population, by that time attitudes had changed. And I like to mention at this juncture that sometimes people say, isn't this all hindsight? Aren't you looking back at the war and raising questions about it from the comfort and relative safety of your armchair now in the early 21st century? To which my reply is that 2,500 years ago, Thucydides, in writing about the Peloponnesian War, said, I want to recount the history of this war in order to show how moral sensibility is coarsened by war, how when you're engaged in the struggle you care less and less as time goes by about what you do. And he gave as the sort of killer example of this the difference between the Athenians' attitude to Mytilene early in the war. Mytilene was a city on Lesbos which had breached the treaty that it had with Athens, And the Athenians discussed the question whether, in punishment, they should massacre the population of Mytilene. If they had bombers, they would have done it that way, but in those days they didn't. They decided against it. They decided not to massacre the population, mainly for prudential reasons, but the fact that they had the debate at all had behind it a moral impulse. But 12 years later, when the city of Milos wouldn't play ball with Athens, there was no debate. The population was massacred. And Thucydides wanted people to be alert to this fact, to the coarsening effect of war. And it's a lesson that applies not just to the Second World War and to the bomber's story in that war, but to us at all points in our history, including now. Anyway, 14th of February 1942, the primary task of Bomber Command was to attack the morale of the enemy population. That meant systematic and repeated attacks on urban areas, on civilian populations, with the express purpose of killing and terrorizing as many of them as possible. Because the kind of aircraft, like the big Lancaster and Halifax and Stirling 4-engine bombers, which could carry tremendous bomb loads, twice the bomb load of a B-17 Flying Fortress, and the kind of weaponry, because that was still in process, and it wasn't really until 1943 that Sir Arthur Harris had the weapon that he wanted to carry out this anti-morale campaign against the German population. It was only then, in 1943, that the really great raids happened. And the first of them was the very aptly named Operation Gomorrah, which took place in late July, early August 1943, and in which the very first fire storm occurred. And it's been very eloquently written about by W.G. Sebald in his essay, The Natural History of Destruction. And there he points out how many people of the about 40,000 people who were killed in that one night were asphyxiated in their cellars and in their air raid shelters. How many of them caught in the open in the firestorm were so severely burned that their bodies shrank from adult size to the size of babies or dolls. How many people were picked up by the firestorm, burning and flung away in the vortex of these terrible winds. These were frightful, frightful effects of the bombing. And the point about them is that they were deliberate, because the Royal Air Force thought very carefully about what its bomb load would be like. It would have 25% high explosives, 75% incendiaries. And these incendiaries had an early form of napalm, petroleum jelly, phosphorus, bituminous substances, and oil-soaked rags. And the phosphorus, if it splashed as it did, it was designed to splash over a very wide area. If it splashed onto a human being, that person would begin to burn very fiercely. And they might, as thousands of people did in Hamburg, throw themselves into the canals to put out the flames, only to find, to their horror, that when they got out of the water, it would reignite spontaneously. It was a terrible collection of weapons that were dropped with the aim of doing as much harm as possible to the civilian population in those cities. Now, these facts, and they are terrible facts, could be countered by saying, look, war is terrible. You know, horrible things happen in war. And when it's a war to the death and a war against a very formidable and wicked enemy as the Nazi regime was, you know, the gloves are off. And this has sometimes been very, very well expressed in a chilling phrase by no less a person than Mao Zedong, who once said, war is not crochet. And everything that follows from that follows. And when people say this to me, my response to them is to say, would that mean that it's okay in the course of a war to bayonet babies? Which is a sort of shocking thought, a shocking thing to say. And most people say, well, no, of course not. And most people would agree that something like My Lai in Vietnam was a crime, which implies that there are limits. And that instantly raises the question, where do the limits lie? And it raises the further question, was the systematic bombing of civilian populations in Germany and Japan beyond the limits? And to examine that question, and the book is dedicated to it, and I haven't got much time, but very, very briefly, what I have to do and try to do in the book is to look at the argument that says, no, it wasn't beyond the limits in the context of the war. That is, that if there was a genuine military necessity, if it really helped to win the war, then that fact trumps our moral scruples about doing this. And so that becomes the key focus of the discussion, really, to ask whether it really did help to win the war. And the answer is that it didn't. People say that by bombing the cities, keeping the workers awake when they weren't killed, making life difficult for the German population and administration as a whole because of the disruption caused by bombing, that it must have done something to slow down, to dent German production. It must also, of course, have kept forces back in Germany, anti-aircraft forces, troops, and aircraft to defend against these attacks. The second of those two arguments can be very quickly and simply met, which is to say that no matter what you were bombing, even if you were bombing transport and factories and military installations and roads, they would have had to keep back anti-aircraft guns and aircraft. So that doesn't defend area bombing, attacks on civilians. But as to the question of industrial production of all kinds, not just military production, increased year on year in Germany until the end of 1944. The German economy, which was very, very strong by the time war broke out, and which, as a result of conquests in Central and Eastern Europe, had vast manpower resources, vast natural resources available to it following those conquests, was never put on a war footing. It was never the case that a single German woman was conscripted into a factory to make weapons, as was the case, for example, in Britain. There was so much labour that could be drafted in from Eastern Europe, slave labour and prisoner labour, that there was never any necessity for it. And production of all things, including luxury items and double beds and flower pots and all the rest of it, went on and on right until the end of 1944. And what stopped it was the drying up of fuel, coal and oil and gas. And that was the result of attempts at precision bombing, tactical daylight bombing, very dangerous, by the United States Army Air Force, who were only, as it happens, those of you who have read about this will know, really effective from very late 1943 and 1944 certainly onwards, because of the Mustang fighter aircraft, long-range fighter aircraft, could fly all the way from the east coast of England to Berlin and back, and could protect the bombers. And it was in fact the Mustangs and Lightnings that accompanied the bomber fleets which fought the Luftwaffe out of the sky. On D-Day there were something like 12,000 Allied aircraft in operation over France, and something like 800 Luftwaffe aircraft to defend against them. And so the effect that the United States endeavours had in the European theatre was a very considerable one. So the major argument that the area bombing, that is bombing civilian populations by night, was a major factor in helping to win the war, looks very questionable. Just to be brief, because I'm sure I'm running over time, I must turn attention to the American endeavours in the Pacific theatre. And there, I'm afraid, the United States went 180 degrees in the opposite direction from what they had done in the European theatre. There's no question of precision bombing in Japan once the Mariana Islands had been captured and airfields built there, so that the main islands of Japan were within range of the Pacific bombing force under the direction of Curtis LeMay, a well-known name, I think. There was hardly any Japanese Air Force left at that time, and precious little anti-aircraft defense on the ground in mainland Japan. And so Curtis LeMay told his flyers to strip out the guns, the defenses of the aircraft themselves, since they just made the aircraft heavier, to fill them up with incendiary bombs, and to bomb from a low altitude, and to burn the cities of Japan. And this he did systematically in the last 8 months or so, or 9 months of the war. The first great incendiary attack was on Tokyo on the 9th and 10th of March 1945, when 85,000 people were burned to death in that city. I was told by an email correspondent just before I flew over the Atlantic to come here about the work that was done at the WWII Proving Grounds in Utah near Salt Lake City prior to the bombing campaign over Japan, where replicas of wooden Japanese houses were built so that they could test which kind of incendiary bomb would burn it most effectively. And so the campaign was, of course, a well thought out and deliberate one, and it was a tremendously destructive one. In the 9 months or so of the bombing of Japan, as many people were killed and wounded in Japan among the civilian population as were killed and wounded in Germany by bombing in the whole of the war. So about 350,000 dead and about 800,000 injured in both cases, although the figures, of course, are very approximate. And I suppose the final point about the United States Army Air Force endeavours in the Pacific theatre is that more than 4 months before the atom bombs were dropped on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the Japanese had begun to make overtures for a truce, for a ceasefire. They were doing it through the Russians, who weren't at that time at war with them. The Russians only declared war on Japan on the 6th of August 1945, when it was going to be an easy land grab. You still have some of the Japanese islands, as you know. And so the Japanese made overtures to the United States through the Russians. And there was one condition, and that was that they could keep the emperor. But you may remember that Roosevelt and Churchill had decided at Casablanca that there were to be no conditions, and this was used, some people say, as an excuse by the Truman administration not to talk to the Japanese about a ceasefire until the atom bombs had been dropped. To the very, very great credit of a man called Henry Stimson, who was Secretary of Defense in the Roosevelt administration, he tried to dissuade Truman from dropping a bomb on a populated city. He said, drop one of them on an uninhabited island to show what the weapon can do. But his suggestion wasn't taken. And so he struck the word Kyoto off the list of possible targets of the atom bombs because he knew of the significance of that city. Now, looking back on it now from this perspective, and this is my final point, one notices that in the immediate aftermath of the war, that is in the years from 1945 to 1949, tremendous endeavors were made by the international community, by the world as a whole, you might say, to try to put in place a framework of law, or at very least of principles, which would make the things that had happened during the course of the war impossible. I mean, that was the ideal that people set themselves when they wrote and agreed upon the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. And it was certainly the aim of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which was written and signed in 1949, the Convention on the Protection of Civilians in War. That convention, in its draft form, had in it some clauses which specifically protect civilians from attacks by bombing. And the British and the Americans refused to have those clauses included, because to agree to them would have been a retrospective admission of guilt of something that they'd done during the course of the war. It wasn't until 1977 that a protocol was added to that convention specifically outlawing bombing attacks on civilians. The British government signed it. Your own government, and I'm not entirely sure of the technicality, it may be that it was never signed by the United States government or has not been ratified by Congress, but at any rate, not taken to be in force from Washington's point of view to this day, which makes this whole question really about the deliberate and systematic massacre bombing of civilian populations a live issue still. During the war itself, by the way, in the United Kingdom, there was a very, very vigorous campaign of opposition to area bombing. Questions were asked in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. Bishop Bell of Chichester repeatedly said in the House of Lords, "We're fighting barbarians, why are we behaving like them too?" The Mass Observation Unit, which was a polling organisation in the UK that kept its finger on the pulse of public opinion during the war, kept on asking people in all around the country what they thought about being bombed and about bombing and whether we should bomb in retaliation for the attacks on us. And people in the cities that had been badly bombed, majorities of people in cities that had been badly bombed, said no, don't bomb their cities. And people in cities that hadn't been bombed at all said, yes, bomb them. And that's a very interesting fact about attitudes at the time. There was full knowledge of what was going on. If you read newspaper reports now, all the way through 1943, 44, and 45, you see that there were very explicit reports about what had been attacked, how many bombs had been dropped. There were headlines in the Telegraph newspaper, for example, saying, last night, Dusseldorf and Dortmund and Essen received 60 Coventries. In other words, a bomb weight 60 times as great as had been received in Coventry in November 1940. So people knew what was happening at the time. The people who were running the country had read their Thucydides at school and university, and they knew the arguments from 2,500 years before, and all the way through the great tradition of ethical thinking in the West. And so, in many ways, there are no places to hide, except behind the arguments that I very briefly alluded to and discussed at much greater length in the book about the military and industrial justifications that are proffered in defense of the area bombing. I don't think those defenses work, and I think, therefore, very serious question marks rise above that campaign. And the reason why it's relevant to discuss it today is because, although I don't think that there's much point in pointing fingers and calling people war criminals now after the event, or indeed impugning the courage and tremendous sacrifice that was made by young airmen in the war, who thought rightly that they were fighting a just war and that they had the support of their majority of their populations behind them. there's no point in that, but there is every point in trying to draw lessons from it for now, just when in our world we are beginning to find ways of trying to enforce some of these international instruments that were the result of the Second World War, like a human rights framework and like the protections of civilians in times of war, which, because of the kinds of weapons that we have now, is ever more important a question. Thank you very much indeed.
I'd like to thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. Meine Damen und Herren. I'd like to thank the Goethe Institute for inviting me also. I think I too should respond a little to, that's to say, are my glasses on my head? They were here a second ago. Oh, you are so kind. Thank you. I'm sorry, this is not a throat clearing. It's not a plea for sympathy. I expected Dr. Ushrin to say something like that, and for Anthony to take him up on it, Professor Grayling, I should say. I think it's time, really, that we said, look, we have been, all of us, very impressed by the extreme seriousness with which Germany has accepted its post-war responsibilities and discussed them in public, in its own country, and in international fora. There is absolutely no reason at all to suspect that any reopening of this discussion, which has already been quite elaborately undertaken in Germany, even Günter Grass, with his new novel, The Crab Walk, has broken a few things that were once taboo. There's no reason at all to suspect that Germany would become intoxicated by any vengeance, fantasy, or any grievance, or any spurious moral equivalence. There's nothing to apologize for, in other words, in the opening of this discussion, and all of us, British and American, I think, should have said this a long time ago. I very much congratulate Professor Grayling on a very lucid summary of his own book. That's not as easy to do, actually, summarizing your own work, as some people might think. And I know he won't penalize me for saying that much of the argument was, at least to some extent, familiar to some of you, even if not at the very elevated level at which he presented it, which enables me or frees me to propose a few ironic references to it. I was going to start where he ended, and I'll be brief, by saying that not only has this argument, I mean, Jörg Friedrich in his book Der Brand, is only the most recent in Germany, but this argument has been going on in Britain for a very long time, and did in fact begin, I think, rather to the credit of my fellow countrymen, if I may say that, during the war. Not just to Bishop Ralph Bell of Chichester, who raised the question in Parliament, as did others, not just Vera Brittain, whose extraordinary book on the subject is still very much in print and very much debated, but someone who I'm proud to say was a friend of mine, the late Tom Dryburgh. Actually, he died ennobled as Lord Bradwell, socialist though he was at the time a very important newspaper columnist in London, and in his column in the Daily Express revealed the case of a German girl named Hilda, who had been orphaned. Every single person she knew, not just all her family, everyone she knew had gone and been burned to death in a German city. And he opened his column with a big picture of her and the question right across the page. In 1944, I think, should we be bombing Hilda? And this was a live discussion in Parliament, in the church, in clubs and pubs and at places of work and in bombed cities. And it was right to have all these qualms and misgivings then, and if it was right to have them then, we don't need to apologize for having them now. Sir Solly Zuckerman, I remember reading it when I was quite young, very shocked. Lord Charwell's memorandum to Winston Churchill, saying, I think I've worked out how we could crack their morale. What we need to do is to find the working class quarters of the German cities, where the houses are packed closer together, and where we would get, as it were, as Americans would now vulgarly say, more bangs for the buck. We can really slaughter them in these working class quarters. Lord Charwell's the chilling memorandum to Churchill. Sir Solly Zuckerman, one of the other directors of this program of bombing, after the war wanted to write a piece about it, a reflection on it, for Cyril Connolly's great cultural magazine, Horizon. And he decided on a visit to Cologne, which was a city he'd had a hand in flattening. And he came back and was interviewed, visited by somebody who said, well, what about the piece? He said, I can't do it. I can't do anything about it. I've seen Cologne now, and I can't write. He said, all I can remember is seeing the total destruction of the cathedral and seeing a human finger on the top of a pile of rubble, and I've got writer's block about the subject. But he said, I had a title at least, and the title was going to be On the Natural History of Destruction. Later annexed by the great German writer W.G. Sebold, who Anthony also mentioned, who we were very privileged to have amongst us in Britain for many decades as a writer and a teacher. I stipulate, therefore, that I absolutely know what Professor Grayling is talking about. And the most haunting thing in his book, I think, is the one he didn't draw attention to, which is this. Bomber Command, and to some extent the United States Army Air Force, did this to Germany in the closing years of the war for one reason above all: because they could do it. They did it because they could. They weren't able to do it earlier in the war, when it might, who knows, I'm going to come to that, have made a difference. But by this stage, that was what they knew how to do, had built the equipment for, had trained for, had rehearsed for. They were going to do it. It's not unlike the very gruesome moment at the end of the first Gulf War with Saddam Hussein. Actually, I believe that that's one long war myself. I think it's been going on since 1991 and only recently been concluded. But let's call it the first Gulf War in 1991, where Saddam's forces were withdrawing from Kuwait, got themselves trapped in a huge traffic jam with a lot of other stragglers, as you may remember, in the Mutla Pass on the way back to Iraq. That convoy was bombed and strafed for days, for hours, days, by American fighters and bombers who couldn't believe their luck, from aircraft carriers anchored not far away, including the USS Ranger. Why did they blast them? Because they could. They didn't blast the Republican Guard, more's the pity. They didn't take out Saddam Hussein, more's the pity. But they could do this to the Iraqis, and some Kuwaitis too. Well, we have to live with this. We have to be intensely serious about it. I had to go and give a talk at the RAF Club in London the other day on another matter, and I felt the qualm I always feel when I go onto the premises of the RAF, the picture of Air Marshal Harris on the wall, things of this kind. I was brought up to think of Fighter Command as the heroes, as Anthony was. Bomber Command always been a bit more difficult for us. But I have an anecdote I'm just going to tell you now, which I think makes the history of the RAF imperishable, though most RAF people don't know about it. The midnight of the century, as we old comrades call it, the midnight of the century is the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the worst moment in the history of civilization. The handshake between Molotov and Ribbentrop, the raising of the swastika flag over Moscow airport, the singing of the Horst Wessel lead on Moscow radio, the embrace of the two dictators, the crushing of Poland between them, the destruction of the Baltic, abolition really of the Baltic states, and the preparation for a ghastly war. Well, Mr. Molotov was back in Berlin, because the alliance went on well into the 40s, as you know, on one balmy night in late 1940, early 1941, and he had to take shelter with his ghastly Nazi hosts because the RAF had arrived on a rather paltry raid, but it was enough to send the Nazis and their guests, rather embarrassed, down into the shelter. And while Molotov was there with his Nazi friends, he said, "I thought you told me this could not happen." I don't think the pilots knew how brilliantly they had performed on this occasion, but if you allow yourself to think about this rather magnificent moment where it's Britain's airmen against Hitler and Stalin combined, mantles the English cheek with a great blush of pride, then you reflect on, you are obliged to reflect on the following. 2 years before, a group of Germans who we know them by some of them by their individual names, some of them by their collective name, the Kreisau Group, a group of very important German soldiers and diplomats and officers and civilian politicians, grouped around the heroic, I think, especially heroic, General Helmut von Moltke. Ludwig Beck was another member of it. Admiral Canaris was briefly a member, I believe. At my old college in Oxford, we had an annual commemoration for Adam von Trott-Zussolz, who was another member of it, later to give his life hideously in the plot to kill Hitler in 1944. They sent an envoy to Neville Chamberlain and said, if you and your foreign minister, Mr. Halifax, if you will guarantee that you will stand by Czechoslovakia, in other words, if you will say that a move into Czechoslovakia means war, we can decapitate the Nazi regime and tell the German people we have saved them not just from the foul dictator, but from war as well, that we have struck for peace as well as for democracy. But we need your guarantee that you will fight for Czechoslovakia before we can act. The risk these gentlemen took in making this move is something that's very difficult to imagine as a matter of quality and bravery. And they were told, forget it. We like the present situation in Germany. We hope, rather, to make an alliance with it against Stalin, against communism. And as Trotsky was the first to point out, once they made that pact at Munich with Hitler, ignoring the opposition in Germany, they made the Hitler-Stalin pact inevitable. So that the whole might of Britain, air, navy and military, which was exerted on Hitler's side in 1938, should later be used to bomb and destroy German civilians, is a conclusion that's inescapable, very Stalin pointed out, and, if you like, impossible to live with. And to make it worse, we find, within a few years of this, that the obliteration of the city of Dresden, one of the most extraordinary achievements of European civilization, the entire obliteration of it and most of its people, is being justified for one reason and one reason alone. If we do it, it will impress Joseph Stalin, whose forces are pressing in on the other end. Now, I think if you're going to destroy a cultural treasure house and ignite a firestorm that is designed to consume all of the people in it, you had better have a better reason than it might bring a smile to Joseph Stalin's face. And this is not part of our official history. This is not what we're taught in school, ladies and gentlemen, in England, meine Damen und Herren, I can assure you. Now, how to confront these, I hope I've connected them for you, these multiply imbricated crimes and ironies and tragedies, how to make sense of it. The way I propose to do it is this, by imagining myself not as an Englishman or an Anglo-American, but as a German, which I'd be proud to be, and in fact, on my mother's side, through the city of Breslau, going back quite a long way now, I am. I was brought up in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War in Plymouth and Portsmouth. I remember being told not to play on the bomb sites. I remember seeing the ruins, the smell that still went on, actually, of the dug out, collapsed buildings and so forth. I remember the devastation. It was the scene of my upbringing. I also remember the little island of Malta, where I was partly brought up too, which was almost totally destroyed. Its beautiful capital, Valletta, almost completely destroyed by the air forces of Hitler and Mussolini. I especially remember the awful wreckage of the Royal Opera House in the centre of the city. And my father was a member of the Royal Navy and had a very tough time indeed in the North Atlantic and elsewhere. On Boxing Day, if you care, 1942, his ship sank the Scharnhorst, which was about to undertake a terrible campaign against civilian shipping in the North Sea. It was a better day's work than I've ever done. I mention it just in cases of interest. But in my heart and sinew, I feel German about this. And if I can commit the embarrassment of mentioning the following names, not in the same breath as my own, of course, I hope I'll make my point. I'm thinking of Thomas Mann. I'm thinking of Pastor Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great great Protestant resistors of Franz Jägerstatter, who was executed rather than join Hitler's army as a Catholic. He was an Austrian. I'm mentioning Austrians too. Ernst Fischer, who broadcast from Moscow against the advances of the Wehrmacht in Russia. Chancellors Willy Brandt and Bruno Kreisky, who left their own countries and joined the armed forces of others rather than surrender to fascism. Kurt Schumacher. Some of you will know some of these names. All of them, I think, should be made imperishable in our history as well as that of Germany and Austria. And these, of course, are heroes I'm talking about. But how many heroes do you think there might have been whose names we'll never know in, say, Hamburg, a city that had always withstood the National Socialists, that had always remained, as it were, red and democratic? How many people who carried within themselves the seeds of a future Germany, and a better Germany, were destroyed by the RAF? We used to have a question, a rather smug one in England after the war. Where were all the good Germans all this time? Well, one answer to that, I'm very sorry to say, is many of them were buried and burned alive by the Royal Air Force. And the fact has to be faced. But now look at it the other way. We got Billy Wilder, Albert Einstein, Theodor Adorno, Marlene Dietrich, Sigmund Freud, and the Germans got Julius Streicher in exchange for the collapse of civilization that was undertaken by Nazism. And I now come to another name, that of Victor Klemperer. Could I just get an idea of how many of you in the room know who I'm talking about? Oh, that's admirable. Well, for those on C-SPAN then, if I can, media conscious Hitchens. Victor Klemperer, the cousin, I think, of the famous conductor Otto, was a German Jew, convert to Protestantism, married to a German Protestant woman, professor of French language and literature at the University of Dresden, and on the first day of the Third Reich he decided to keep a diary, and he kept it every single day till 1933. He's the only man of whom we can read of every single day of the Third Reich. It's called I Will Bear Witness. Don't start reading it late at night, would be my advice. Do not start reading it late at night, because you know what's coming and he doesn't. So when they take away his cat, because Aryan cats are not allowed to live in partly Jewish homes, seriously, when they take away his job, when they take away his ration book, when they make him wear the star, when they say you can't now use the tram, you can't now use the bus, all this humiliation, you know it's going to get only steadily worse. And you're only encouraged by the fact that almost every day he reports that a member of the German working class comes up to him and says, "Cheer up, mate, these bastards will soon be gone. Don't worry, we're with you. The scoundrels can't last much longer." The way he listens to the radio, the way he looks at the newspapers, the way he disproves, if you like, the Daniel Jonah Goldhagen thesis, which I regard as a defamation of the German people and of their history, the vile collectivization of guilt that's involved in the willing executioner. But for all the friendship he's shown, the machine grinds on and on. And finally, it's come time to deport the last element to the east, the ones who have Aryan wives, German wives or husbands, the last ones they get round to. And he's moved into a holding camp in the middle of Dresden on, I think, the night of the 12th of February, 1945, with his wife. And the next day, it's on the train. But that night, the heavens open. Anyone who's read an account of what happened in Dresden that night doesn't need any words from me. The terrible thing, according to Frederick Taylor's book, is the climatic conditions were even better than they had hoped. It succeeded too well. It wasn't just a firestorm, it was, I think it's justifiable to use the term Holocaust, which many people object to, because it means the total destruction of something by fire. I do not believe it should be called a final solution, or an Endlösung, as the Germans would say. That would be quite untrue. But yes, a massive destruction by fire. And in the morning, there's no authority in Dresden anymore. And there's no one to take him to the train with his wife. And they peel off their yellow stars. She's made to wear one too. And they set off for their home and start looking for the Red Army. It's over. It's completely over. There's no one to give orders, and there's no one who will take them anymore. The only thing I think in our collective experience and imagination that one could call upon is General Sherman's decision to lay waste to the Confederacy, to make sure that not one brick is piled upon another until it is understood who is master now and who has lost, and to make that conclusive. I think it would have been better if Anthony had dealt in his book with the psychological effect of the years of the Thousand-Year Reich. It had to be utterly disproved that there was a leader who was all-powerful and all-knowing, as so many were willing to believe. It had to be conclusively shown that when they said, "We will never allow a bomber in our own skies," that they were completely wrong. Do I have a minute to read something from Thomas Mann?
Yeah.
Thomas Mann wasn't Jewish. Thomas Mann was not Jewish, as you know, but he decided he couldn't live in Germany under these conditions. And in his great novel, I think, Dr. Faustus, published, I think, first in 1947, he plays the part of a German watching what's happening. He says, describing the Finis Germaniae of the US AAF and the RAF, he says, "This earth-shaking, plummeting havoc has come breathtakingly close to my refuge several times now. The dreadful bombardment of the city of Dürer and Willibald-Pirkheimer was no longer some distant event. And as the last judgment fell upon Munich as well, I sat here in my study turning ashen, shaking like the walls and doors of my house. Its famous publishing district is, I sadly hear, only a heap of rubble, and an immeasurable wealth of literary and educational material is now the spoil of destruction. A loss not only for us Germans, but also for a whole world that cares about culture." That world, however, is apparently willing to take the loss into the bargain. Granted, he says, The destruction of our cities from the air has long since turned Germany into an arena of war, and yet we find it inconceivable, impermissible to think that Germany should ever again, could ever become such an arena in the true sense. And our propaganda has a curious way of warning the foe against incursion upon our soil, our sacred German soil, as if that would be some grisly atrocity. Our sacred German soil, as if anything was still sacred about it, as if it had not long ago been desecrated again and again by the immensity of our rape of justice and did not lie naked, both morally and in fact, before the power of divine judgment. Let it come, says Mann. And then he says, when he thinks about Würzburg and all the beautiful gem-like cities of Germany being turned into powder and ash, this is terrible. He said, but I cannot allow myself to forget that terrible though German defeat is, it is nothing compared to the horror of German victory. He's willing to come to terms with it. He seems almost to invite something that is a judgment against which no appeal can ever be made. It's finished. There's going to be no myth this time that we could have won if we'd hung on a couple more years. That we were stabbed in the back by the Jews, they certainly weren't by then. That the cretinous homosexuals and communists and pacifists undermined German morale. No excuses this time. It's over. You have conclusively lost. And we can now begin to reconstruct German democracy and culture and civilization, which we did. Don't let it be forgotten. Sebald, in his book, which I greatly admire, refers to a war of annihilation. I think he should have not employed that word. Did not annihilate Germany. British and American soldiers did not commit atrocities against German civilians. Hitler's former allies in the Red Army committed the most appalling atrocities on German civilians, but if you lie down with the devil in that way, this is what you have to expect. We have everything to be proud of, it seems to me, in the resilience of the German people, who re-emerged from the rubble very quickly, without self-pity, without resentment, without conspiracy theories, to begin in this task of reconstructing not only Germany, but also a Europeanized Germany and a democratic Europe, in which Germany still has pride of place as a centerpiece in economics, in culture, in publishing, in democracy, and is something of which we are all of us consider ourselves friends of the German people, rightly proud, justifiably proud. I do not myself believe that without, I won't call it a war of annihilation, but without an annihilating, conclusive, incontestable, utter victory of the kind that Sherman imposed on slavery, that when the slaves were freed from the camps, that when the Klemperers could walk again in the street without the yellow star, that there wasn't that day a feeling of liberation. Heinrich Böll, in his closing letter to his sons, the one he wanted them to read after he died, his posthumous letter to his sons, one of the greatest German authors of all time, I think, says, "My boys, you will, as you grow up, always know what to think of any of your fellow countrymen, according as to whether they describe April 1945 as the month of German liberation or German defeat. Never forget this. Neither should we." Now, in closing, I've got to say two things about Anthony's book that gravely disappointed me, in that he didn't mention himself. One, I think that he should not have said that it would have been right for the air crews of the American and British air forces to refuse to obey these orders. I think it is of the first importance in the time of warfare, when civilian and democratic government is not just in command but at stake, where its existence is at stake, that the civilian and elected governments have the right to assume that they know the larger strategic picture and that their orders will be obeyed. And I think the suggestion that there should have been a mutiny in the middle of a war against the Third Reich is an immoral one, and I think you should withdraw it. I think it was entirely right for those orders to be obeyed, whatever the doubts may have been, because it is not the place of officers to take the place of members of Parliament and the British Cabinet. And then I'm going to have to read a chapter, a paragraph that I think disfigures the book. And I'll just quickly do this, and I think then it really will be time for me to end my hostage-taking of this audience. Anthony says, "A surprise attack on a civilian population aimed at causing maximum hurt, shock, disruption, and terror that comes to seem very little difference in principle between the RAF's Operation Gomorrah or the USAAF's atom bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York by terrorists on 11th of September 2001. And this latter prescinding from differences in scale and the drama of the target, is no different in turn from terrorist bombings carried out in Madrid by Basque separatists or in London by the IRA. All these, there's an amalgam here. Terrorist attacks are atrocities, consisting in deliberate mass murder of civilians to hurt and coerce the society they belong to. To say that the principle underlying 9/11, Hamburg and Hiroshima is the same is to say that the same moral judgment applies to all three. I'm sorry, I won't pass that. I won't take that. The terrorist organization, which is also a criminal multinational corporation, a secret society, a fanatical religious cult, and many other things, run by Osama bin Laden, is replying to no offense committed against itself. It's not attempting to protect or defend its own civilians. Is concerned with other people's civilians only to the extent that casualties in their ranks may be maximized to the greatest possible extent, and has not even a jot or tittle of justification on any strategic matter. I think it's quite indecent to mention these things in the same breath. I think spurious moral equivalence is the thing that must at all costs be avoided in this argument, and I do hope that that sentence isn't in the book when it's published in Germany. Very well. Thank you very much, comrades, and thank you, Anthony, for putting up with me.
Which of these working?
You have to use the other microphone.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Oh, I see. This one. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay. So I can hold this like that? Am I going to use this?
Next to the other one?
Okay. Okay, thanks. Oh, thank you. We're being wired.
Well, I have a carrying voice for work.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Like Dr. Evil.
Yeah, exactly.
I very probably am sitting on the microphone.
Yeah, there you go. Is that okay? Is it echoing? Is that okay? Rich? That's all right? Okay. Well, I think it would be only fair to start the next section of this by offering the floor back to Anthony, if you would like to respond to the last couple of points that Christopher made. And then
sure.
I have a question that I wanted to ask both of you, and then we certainly can open it up to questions from the floor.
Well, there are a number of things in that very rich and eloquent presentation by Hitch there that I'd love to respond to, but I'll pick out two, which I think perhaps are most significant. The first is on the question of the annihilating attack, the definitive defeat of Germany, the fact that the Germans must know that they've been, smashed, and they've got to start absolutely from scratch. One thing that struck me as I was working on the book was the fact that Roosevelt and Churchill had signed, only very shortly afterwards to rescind, a plan that had been put forward by the Secretary of the Treasury here in the United States in Roosevelt's administration, a man called Henry Morgenthau. This is known as the Morgenthau Plan. And this plan was devised against the background of much discussion, most of it which went on here in the US, about what to do about Germany after the war. And these discussions were of all kinds. They ranged from very extreme ideas that the German people should be sterilized so there won't be any more of them in future, to let's take all the German children out of Germany, put them into Australia and places where they could learn cricket, so that when they went back to England, they would, back to Germany, they behaved themselves. The idea was to try and extirpate Prussian militarism, to try to get rid of the culture that had twice plunged the world into war in a single generation. And Morgenthau's idea was that Germany should be deindustrialized, the Ruhr should be handed over to France and the Netherlands and Luxembourg and so on, and it should be divided into two purely agrarian countries, purely agricultural countries. Now Roosevelt and Churchill signed this, but they were told by their respective foreign secretaries, Henry Stimson and Anthony Eden, what a very, very bad idea this was. Eden pointed out to Churchill that a reconstructed Germany was going to be vital for Europe. It was going to be vital as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, because that was going to be the next big threat. And it was vital as a trading partner anyway for Britain itself. And so the idea was torn up. But the fact that it was put forward at all, the fact that it got as far as it did in the debate, speaks volumes really about a whole background of opinion that had its influence indirectly on the conduct of the bombing campaigns. Now, just before I get to the second point that I need to address, remember this, that we're talking here about one aspect of the bombing campaign, although it happened to be more than 50% of what the RAF did, and that is area bombing, deliberate attacks on civilians to massacre and terrorize civilians. That aspect of the bombing campaign was fueled by the sense that when you bomb a city, you don't only bomb the people in it, but you bomb the schools, the libraries, the concert halls, the archives, the monuments, the art galleries, the places where they make violins, places where they record music. In other words, you bomb the culture. In the book I call it culturecide, the idea that you could exterminate the culture as well as the people in order to smash it and start afresh. And this ties in very much with Hitchens' idea about an annihilating defeat that would make it possible for them to start afresh and to do it right. And I think, as many people did during the war itself, in The Seed of Chaos, that wonderful pamphlet that Vera Brittain wrote, she makes the point that there were plenty of people in Germany who weren't supporters of the Nazis. You know, as Hitch says, the city of Hamburg had been the center of opposition to Nazism, and yet it suffered the first very big attack, annihilating attack that the RAF Bomber Command had mounted. And so what was happening was that the people who were going to be needed and the resources that were going to be needed, the clinics and schools and books and music halls that were going to be needed in the reconstruction effort afterwards, were being destroyed in the process. And so one has to put a question mark over that. That's the first point. The second point, I must take up the direct challenge about my 9/11 analogy. I was trying there very carefully by making the point about prescinding from other considerations, on which, by the way, I agree absolutely with Hitch. There's a very big difference between the British and the RAF that was carrying out that policy in 1943, 1944, 45, and Osama bin Laden and his criminal fraternity carrying out the 9/11 attack. Of course there is. That goes without saying. But the point that I wanted to make was this, that if you think it is a bad thing that anybody should try to kill and terrorize civilians, non-combatants, in order to coerce their government or to do harm to their polity by carrying out an attack of that kind, then you've got to be consistent, and you've got to recognize that on that particular point there is a comparability between deliberately and systematically attacking civilians in cities, as we did in Germany and Japan during the war. So I'm going to stick with that argument.
Christopher, do you want to follow on that?
Very quickly, yes. If the bombing, or indeed if the war aim in general, because it would have been consistent with precision bombing as well, had been to impose the Morgenthau Plan, I don't think it would possibly be defensible. So I simply, in a way, want to signal agreement with Anthony about that, except that it was not the policy. It was I think it was actually disowned before the intervention of Sir Anthony Eden and others, because in my memory of reading the Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence of their meeting in Quebec, and so anyone can check this if they wish, it's the Quebec meeting, it's discussed. Roosevelt says, this is what Morgenthau thinks. What do you think? Churchill says, sounds like a good idea to me. They go on rather uneasily. And I think it reads to me like a competition, which of them is going to be the first to say, actually, did we just agree to that or not? Churchill is at any rate the first. He says, it sounds to me, I remember his words, he says immoral and unchristian. I don't see what's unchristian about mass murder, I have to say, but there you go. That's how some people talk. Anyway, it would have been also, by the way, a very, very much stiffer and wider opposition in Britain and America to this politically, and for the excellent reason that what it really is, the Morgenthau Plan, is a replay of the Versailles Treaty, the attempt to humiliate Germany and crush and squeeze its economy, about which Lord Keynes has very famously written his Economic Consequences of the Peace, and indeed an outcome for which many people, partly rightly, blame the rise of Nazism in the first place. So I think any attempt to repeat that blunder would have been met with a very stern and public and democratic opposition. But as it happens, we didn't have to worry about that. I'll just have to repeat a little more sternly, I think, the point about, and you didn't take me up on mutiny, but maybe you didn't want to.
On mutiny?
On telling them our guys should have disobeyed.
Oh, right, yeah, okay, I'll respond to that, because I have a point about
because I can't believe that you would let it slide.
Yeah.
But on the second point, which was, I had it on 9/11.
9/11.
Yes, look. the action of a non-state actor whose announced policy is not the rebellion against an empire, however crudely conducted, which is the case in your analogy with the Irish Republican Army or the Basque ETA, fighting, however criminally in their tactics for what they conceive of as the sufferings and losses of their people, but rather announced in advance by Al-Qaeda and its supporters as the attempt to impose an empire. In fact, to do worse than that, to rediscover and restore a lost and vanished empire, the Caliphate, on everyone in the world, to install a universal dictatorship, and to show that its means and its ends are exactly symmetrical, because it cares nothing for the life of anyone who isn't a true believer. This is not comparable to anything that the Royal Air Force did. It's just not to be mentioned in the same breath. And I've totally run out of patience with all the liberal and left excuses for this stuff. People who think that Osama bin Laden is some voice of the oppressed or cry of the unheard. That's all balls, okay? He wants East Timor given back to Indonesia, a little country that already almost suffered genocide at Indonesian Muslim hands. He wants it given back. His people blew up the UN ambassador to Iraq because he, the great international civil servant, Sergio de Mello, had overseen the independence of East Timor and its transition. They murdered him for that as an infidel. Look what they did to Afghanistan.
Hitch, you're right about us. I don't want to
we're looking with bin Laden, we're looking fascism in the face with this guy. And yes, I think his defeat should be obliterating, total, final, and humiliating too. And I'd like a bit of applause for that, please. Just for the audience on the TV. Thanks. Not enough applause. Sorry. This is Washington.
It's very, very interesting. What Hitch has done is said he thinks that it was a good thing that the defeat of Germany was an annihilating defeat. I agree with that. I think that the defeat needed to be complete and definitive. We've seen in recent history that if you don't finish the job, then it just comes back to haunt you and makes things worse later. So he's right about that. We're not actually disagreeing on ends here, but we're talking about means. And in fact, in the doctrine of just war, all the way back to Aquinas and Hugo Grotius and all the other people who in our tradition have written about these things, there is this concept of proportionality. If the aim is to defeat the enemy, then let's try and do it if you're going to be as civilized and reflective about it as you can be, even though war is a dirty business. And we've granted from remarks I made earlier on that there have to be limits even in war. Then you've got to try and do it in a way which is consistent with that idea of proportion. And what I mean by it is this. If you have a toothache, you can cure it by chopping off your head, but that's a bit extreme. You try and cure it by a means that leaves the rest of you intact if you can. And so some considered way of doing these things is obviously the preferred option. On the point about I'm drawing an analogy here between the idea of an annihilating defeat and using any means available to you to get that defeat in order to make sure that the monster isn't going to rise up again. And on that, we're absolutely agreed. But what I want to try to do is to discriminate in the literal sense of that term, is to look at a central fact about something. Ask ourselves the question, you've set yourself a certain aim. Is it a legitimate means to that end to pick a civilian population, to attack it, to kill as many of them as you can, to frighten everybody else by that terrifying attack on them? Is that ever justified? Now, there might be circumstances, there might be very, very extreme circumstances where the great and sometimes worthwhile fig leaf of the idea of collateral damage comes into play here. The idea that there are very, very regrettable, sincerely regrettable, but unavoidable casualties of non-combatants, of innocents, of people who aren't engaged when a legitimate target is attacked. But I think one has to be very careful about that. One has to say that has got to be the rare occasion. You've got to make a jolly good case for claiming that it was unavoidable that those people were hurt. And if you're doing something very different from that, if you're actually targeting civilians in order to kill and terrorize, that in itself, the intrinsic quality of that act, no matter whether you think you've got a declared war, no matter whether it's states that are the actors in the case, no matter whether it's a terrorist organization, has to be wrong. If you think 9/11 was wrong, and it was an atrocity, then you've got to think that systematically and deliberately attempting to massacre civilians in any circumstance is an atrocity. So I'm going to stick with that point. Now I must pick up Hitch on the Oh, thank you. There you are. That really was So, the point about mutiny, okay? I think, with great respect, Hitch misreads me there. I didn't think that the RAF should mutiny. I quote in the book the phrase in the Wehrmacht paybook, which said that if you think you've been given an illegal order, you can disobey it. And that it actually happened that Wehrmacht soldiers, I don't think very many SS soldiers did, but some exempted themselves from actions that they didn't agree with and survived. Now, in the case of the Royal Air Force personnel, the USAAF personnel, I say there, in an ideal world, I preface that, don't I? I say, in an ideal situation, if these airmen were asked, will you go in for area bombing civilian populations, or will you go for tactical targets, important military industrial targets, that they should have opted for the latter. I didn't say they should mutiny, certainly not. And I grant also a number of things. I grant that they really believed, with great justification, that they were engaged in a just war, that they had the support of the majority of their populations. These were young men putting their lives on the line. It moves me to think that 55,000 very, very young men died in the sky over Germany in the Royal Air Force from Britain and the British Empire. 45,000 United States Army Air Force personnel died in the air, a terrifying and awful death. And I have to comment because it is one of the awful ironies of war. It's the sort of thing that Hitch would appreciate, maybe. That those 55,000 Royal Air Force personnel died in the process of killing 350,000 Germans. German children and women and elderly people and people who were not directly engaged in active combat. A ratio of 7 to 1. What general would send his troops into battle if he thought those were the odds?
Okay. I think I've got to. I mean, unless, okay, you can vote me down, ladies and gentlemen, if you like, but you haven't voted me down. Well, it isn't preface, actually. I'm not quibbling, but you phrase the question like this, under hard questions. Should airmen have refused to carry out area bombing raids? Yes. Then, as you say, your reasoning follows, but it's not, you don't preface it with that. Yes means yes, it seems to me. And I think I would not have said it. I mean, Commander Hitchens, of blessed memory, I can promise you, did not join the Royal Navy and sail all around the world for His Majesty the King in order to end up running guns to Stalin, which he ended up doing over the hump of Murmansk and Archangel, when the Scandinavian coast was entirely controlled by the Luftwaffe and the seas largely controlled by the U-boats. Very unpleasant job. He thought it was outrageous to be helping the Stalin regime to go. But he did not, I think, well, this is so much against my conscience I can't do it. How could I have impeached him if he had? Well, these might be questions for another day. I think I'm glad on the whole that people decided that the British government was a decent enough one to have its orders obeyed, even if questionable things were being done. And I could instance a whole number of other episodes in the Second World War, possibly the sinking of the French fleet at anchor when it was not in aggressive mode, that the British did, that were also to be questioned and would make an excellent moral exercise. Mm-hmm.
Let me stop you just for a second, because I want to make sure that there is time for questions.
I simply have to say this. It's extending my Klemperer point. Precision bombing would have done an awful lot of damage to the German war effort in Dresden. There's no question about it. And probably more, arguably more than area bombing did. But the next day, precision bombing would have left the same people in charge of Dresden, I'm sorry to say, and Victor Klemperer would have got on that fucking cattle truck. The same, because the order wouldn't have been destroyed. There wouldn't have been total chaos, the utter destruction of the state system and its... Now, anyone who's seen the pictures of those, even in German camps on German soil, relatively lenient, at Buchenwald and Dachau, the condition of the people who were, as they were found by British and American soldiers, can see that those people have only got a few more days to live at best. They're all dying, in effect. Another few months of this war, and they would all have died, as so many of them did in Poland and Hungary and elsewhere. This also has to be borne in mind in considering the Japanese Empire and its hideous god king. Every day that country didn't surrender. I personally opposed to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I can tell you something that Dr. Edward Teller once told me, that it was his view that there should have been a demonstration bomb dropped and not a use of it on civilian cities. But, urgent question to let off a bomb, because every day the Japanese Empire goes on, thousands of its slaves are dying, and we have the right and the duty to save them, it seems to me. So, I am sorry if that's too much, but I felt I couldn't not say that. This is urgent. And it's a terrible utilitarian calculus. Shall you kill more Germans to rescue their slaves and their victims? Well, you could, I suppose, you can compose it by saying, if I prayed, this is what I would say. I don't, but I would say, well, thank God we didn't start this.
Could I trespass on everybody's patience? Because there's a point, not to disagree with Hitch this time, but just a point cognate to what he's just said there, which is that on the 28th of March 1945, Churchill sent a memo to a man called Sir Charles Portal, who was the head of the RAF, to say to him, the terror bombing of the German cities, that's his phrase, the terror bombing, must now stop. He said the bombing of Dresden is a serious query against RAF behavior. It's very, very interesting that he wrote this memo, because at certain points during the war he came out with tremendous speeches about flattening the German cities, and on other occasions he had horrible fits of conscience about it. On one occasion when he leapt to his feet watching footage of bombing of the Ruhr Valley, which was a heavily industrialized area of Germany, and said, are we animals? What are we doing? Why are we doing this? This was right in the middle of the war. And that memo that he sent the 28th of March was returned to him by Sir Charles Portal with a note saying, you can't write to me like this. You're in effect accusing me of a war crime. You can't say this about us. You've got to rewrite this in milder terms, which Churchill did. But the original memo was kept on file and was published by the official historians of Bomber Command in 1960, Webster and Franklin, both of whom had their very serious doubts about the bombing campaign. But what's interesting about it is this. At the end of March, Churchill's anxieties, which I suspect had been fueled certainly by Anthony Eden, but also by senior army officers who were going to and fro between conquered parts of Germany and back to London, and they were saying, "My God, you ought to see what's happened there and what we've done," and all those anxieties. And in fact, Hitch mentioned just that sort of reaction on the part of Dreiberg. But then, within 2 weeks, the first of the concentration camps was liberated by Allied troops. Neuengamme, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, and the footage, the newsreel footage coming out of Germany showing British Tommies and bulldozers moving huge piles of emaciated bodies into mass graves, it so horrified the world, quite rightly so. The whole world was so disgusted and enraged by what it was seeing coming out of Germany that the debate about the bombing was, of course, and I think properly, dwarfed by it. It's one reason why it's taken so long, really, for people to be able to get enough perspective to separate things out. You know, like that game of pick up sticks, you get all the different, separate them out and just look at that part of the bombing campaign, the area bombing campaign, just by itself, and to examine it in our own consciences about it.
March 45 is a funny time for Churchill to develop scruples, especially in view of what I said about the final solution. And I believe I'm right in saying that nowhere in any one of his histories, any one volume of his multi-volume history of the Second World War, is the final solution mentioned.
I had a feeling.
It's a rather large omission from Churchillian historiography.
I had a feeling I wouldn't have to do a whole lot up here to get the conversation going. So I won't ask any questions, but I open the floor up to anyone in the audience. Can we start right there? And then we'll come down to the front row right here. And then we'll go over to this side right here. So those will be the first three, and then we'll keep going. Please.
Mr. Hitchens.
Sir.
Yes.
Apart from the morality of it, do you think that terrorizing civilian populations works?
Well, I think this was liberating a civilian population in part. I mean, we don't know how terrorized people were. We know that the Nazis kept a constant watch on people who appeared to be celebrating or fraternizing with advancing Western Russian troops, hanged them from the lampposts. Some of you may have seen the extraordinary film Downfall, recently made in Germany. Downfall. Extraordinary. The regime kept on acting pornographically till the very, very end, and one can't overlook the fact, since you mentioned the word terrorizing, that Hitler's intention was not just to terrorize the German people, but if possible to have them destroyed as unworthy of National Socialism. He wanted a Holocaust, if you like, for the Germans. It seems to me, it can't be left out of the moral account. I don't believe we were trying to terrorize the population. I think we're making it clear that Hitler had brought them into a trap from which there was no escape, and that the revenge upon this maniac, this monster, would be something that the world would never, ever, ever forget.
Anthony?
I take the burden of your question to be about whether or not the bombing had the effect really of buckling morale. And it's a sort of an oddity in a way, given the fact that the morale of the British people was stiffened, in fact, as well as in propaganda by the bombing, that the conductors of the RAF's bombing campaign, Arthur Harris in particular, shouldn't have realized that there might be a sort of counterproductive effect. And it's really quite interesting to see that in fact happened in Germany. It certainly played into Joseph Goebbels' hands, because he was able to use the area bombing campaign as an argument to the German people for resisting, saying, they're acting in this barbaric way. You can see they no holds barred as far as they're concerned. They're going to do anything to us, so we've really got to hang in there. He was cheered in the streets of Berlin. This is Joseph Goebbels being cheered in the streets of Berlin. And Berliner Schnauzer and all the rest of it, they weren't very happy about the Nazis either, until Harris's so-called Battle of Berlin, which started in late 1943, went through to the early spring of 1944, attempting to break the spirit of the Berliners, and it did anything but. So your question is a very interesting one. The hope that it would force the German population to turn on its government and tell them to sue for peace was an empty one.
Next question's here. Can I just suggest that you address questions to both of them, and I'm sure both of them will pick up on them.
Well, this is particularly to Professor Grayling with regard to the question of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Namely, the argument one hears, which is, I find, at least partially persuasive, is that these use of atomic bombs could be justified in reducing the casualties in the war against Japan, because they shortened the war. I mean, it certainly seems it's clear they did shorten the war. U.S. was getting prepared for a mass invasion and anticipating, perhaps 100,000 casualties, and who knows how many Japanese casualties. So, what would you say about the moral calculus in that decision? Obviously, altogether, maybe 100,000 were killed in the two bombings, but is that...
Still dying, too.
They're still dying.
Still dying.
Yeah, but
Don't
is
forget.
that justify... I mean, can one make the case that preempted, maybe 500,000 being killed?
Well, in order to accept that point, we'd have to accept the premise that the Japanese weren't ready to make peace on the morning of the 6th of August before the first bomb went off. And that now, there's a very, very wide consensus now that's just not the case. That for months beforehand, they'd been making overtures for discussions about peace, and that there were other motives on the American side for not agreeing to talks. They wanted, there seems to be a counter-argument to the point about saving lives, to keep the war going until the bombs were ready. If you ask yourself the question, why did they drop 2 bombs? One might have been enough. Well, the answer is they were 2 different kinds of bombs. They'd kept cities relatively unbombed in order to see what the effect would be, turned down the idea of doing a demonstration. And also for months beforehand, solitary B-29s were sent over Japanese cities, very, very high up, 30,000 feet or 25,000 feet, to drone around a little bit over the city and then go away again, so that the Japanese population would get used to having these solitary, what they thought reconnaissance aircraft overhead. In fact, the Japanese called them Mr. B, sort of harmless bombers that came overhead and then went away. So that on the morning of the 6th of August, when there was a solitary droning B-29 above Hiroshima, nobody took any notice. Nobody was in an air raid shelter or anything else when that bomb went off. And there is a chilling description by Hirsch, I think, talking about seeing a line of soldiers with their hands on the shoulder of the soldier in front, all blind, because they'd all been looking up at the bomber when the flash happened, and their eyes were turned to liquid and ran down their cheeks like tears.
You see, your point would be met by a demonstration bomb of the kind that the famous Dr. Edward Teller told me he had favoured. The same effect could have been produced on the 5th of August or earlier, if other things being equal. The only reason I can think, and I've never heard a justification for Nagasaki, as a matter of fact, is this, because the argument that it shortened the war was never made in 1945 in any cabinet discussion. We have all the papers now. Nobody said, let's do it to shorten the war. Some appear to have said, let's do it to impress Joseph Stalin, which, hey, is the reason we've destroyed Dresden already. Stalin seems to require a lot of immolated cities for his self-satisfaction. The other is possibly to deter the Soviet Union advancing into Japanese islands. But I think not until 1948 does anyone come up with the excuse, well, it shortened the war. So all of you who are out of the Pacific Theater should be grateful you got home early. It's a bogus argument, unfortunately. The other thing one could say is, well, it's completely annihilating. There's going to be no one in the Japanese officer corps after the surrender saying, but perhaps, we could have a comeback one day. The empire will rise again. They know, that's it. You really have lost this time. Again, this is an argument that I find myself very uncomfortable even rehearsing, because it's unquantifiable and possibly wicked. But these are psychological effects we take for granted that we didn't have in our arsenal at the time. Finally, not in the arsenal of the RAF or the USAAF were rocket bombs, V1s and V2s, which started falling on London to a considerable extent in 1945. And in fact, it's universally agreed that British morale at that point was likely to crack, because people thought it was nearly over. And they couldn't stand the thought it was starting again. And this time, not bombers that could be shot down, but rocket bombs exploding without warning. You read Stephen Spender's diaries of being a fireman in London at that point and elsewhere. All that stuff about British pluck and so on. I mean, I'm wedded to it, okay, believe me. But it's very, very overdone. People were really, really flaking. Now, at that point, you say, well, what else? Look, we know the Nazis are trying for horror weapons. What's on the next damn rocket? What do we know is coming? Maybe it'll be gas. Maybe it'll be germs. We don't know. What we do know is we're going to flatten anywhere which can launch one of those damn rockets. And that we're entitled to anything. That's how people are going to think if they're fought in this way. This was Germany, not Germany, but Hitler, urging suicide on his people.
Let me add a couple of things to what Hitchens just said there. Maybe right this point about shortening the war thing was a post facto justification. It did happen, though, that Truman wrote a letter on the 9th of August, the day of the second bomb, in which he said, we will take all measures necessary to reduce the number of our own military casualties. So that point was put that early, in a letter which in other respects is full of weasel expressions like, I'm doing my utmost to ensure that there are no, we minimize civilian casualties and so on. This was written on the 9th of August. So there is that point. Hitch is right, the Germans didn't build big bombers. What they did was they concentrated their efforts on building guided missiles. It was Theodor Adorno, one of the pluses on our side in this exchange,
Absolutely.
Who said, you can tell that the human race has got cleverer over time, but not wiser, because of the development from the spear into the guided missile. Well, the first guided missile was fired off in the summer of 1944. It was kept in reserve for when the invasion happened. And then there was this summer campaign, summer and into the early autumn of 1944, that the V1s and V2s were coming over and causing devastation in London particularly, and one or two other places. The V1, the doodlebug, you could hear it. And then when the engine cut out, you knew it was going to fall, and everybody held their breaths. But the V2, you couldn't hear. You didn't know it was coming until it exploded. And the old lady who lives across the road from me, and I talk in my book about the bomb site across the road from my house, and right next to it is a lady now in her late 80s who was in that house one day when a V2 fell a couple of blocks away. And she tells this story about how she was standing at the window at the kitchen sink, looking through the window, and her little son was playing on the lawn outside, and this terrific explosion went off, and she realized it was a V2, so she ran out to see if her son was okay, and he was absolutely fine, but she wasn't, because the window had been blown in. She was streaming blood, and her little son was traumatized by the vision of this woman streaming blood, screaming at him and running like this with her arms held wide, so you can just imagine how absolutely awful it is. But the V attack had petered out more or less by the autumn of 1944, partly because it was interdicted. There were attacks on the launch sites, but also because the number that the Germans had of them wasn't very great. And it's an interesting fact that in the autumn of 1944, Arthur Harris got back command of Bomber Command. It had been under Eisenhower's charge since before the D-Day landings, and had done a fantastic job, which Harris always claimed he could never do, of tactical bombing of supplies and the German army in France, and railheads and bridges and so on. And he got it back, and between the autumn of 1944 and the 25th of April 1945, when the bombing campaign was stood down, Arthur Harris had dropped more bombs on Germany than in the whole of the war beforehand. And he had a list of cities, and they included gems like Fort Simon, Hildesheim and Würzburg and others, that were bombed, and the people who lived in them just could not understand why.
Because he could.
Because he could. That's exactly the point, yeah.
The next question is this gentleman here in the white shirt, and then we're going to go up to the back for a question after that.
I'd like to make two brief factual points. The first one, both of you mentioned that Hamburg was the center of the German working class, the implication being that a lot of good people died in the firebombing of Hamburg. I think it's worth mentioning in this connection that Hamburg also was the home of Police Battalion 101, which is described by Christopher Browning in his harrowing description of how the mass killing of Jews took place, the killing of women, children by mass shootings, thousands of victims being shot by these good people from Hamburg every day. Now, the second point is more important. According to the man in charge of German war production, Speer, there was a degrading effect as a result of the area bombing of German cities. And Speer gives figures that so many more planes could have been produced and so many more tanks could have been produced and so forth. I'm not prepared to argue that this is decisive, that this is a matter of end justifying means and so forth, but I think it should become part of the moral calculus, and therefore it is wrong simply to say the area bombing was had no utility at all, possibly it was even counterproductive and so forth. The facts are it had some effect, and that should be taken into account.
Anthony?
On that second point, I think, when Speer was in prison before the Nuremberg trials, he was invited by an Allied commission to come and talk to them about production during the war. And he astonished them by saying that until the end of 1944, production was on the up. He made the point to an audience that wanted to hear it, that it wasn't rising as fast as he would have liked. Yes, that takes account of that point. But the fact of the matter is that it was rising. He complained that Hitler never allowed him to put the economy on a total war footing because Hitler had this anxiety about what had happened in 1919 when the German economy couldn't provide cigarettes and flower pots and things like that to the German people who were annoyed about it because lots of shortages occurred because of this transfer of productive capacity to other ends. And so he never allowed it. And it turned out never to be necessary anyway because of the enormous resources that were available. And it was the bottleneck things, the oil, the coal, the transport, that in the end scuppered it. And it was in January 1945 that Speer wrote to Hitler and said, the war is over from the production point of view because I just now can't get the resources together to do it. In the book, by the way, I quote how the Germans dealt with bombing damage. I talk in particular about the 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne in 1942, how many millions of cigarettes and sheets and pints of milk and loaves of bread were on the autobahns going into Cologne within days of the bombing raid, how short a time it took to rehouse people, partly because the Germans knew that since they were going to start the war, they made preparations for it very early, beginning 1935 or 36, but also because they had these massive manpower resources that never affected their military capacity. On the day that the war ended in Europe, the day that Berlin fell, there were 10 million men of military age in the Wehrmacht between the ages of 18 and 35, all with boots on and all with guns in their hands.
But you do say, I actually personally regard Albert Speer as a pathological liar. He was always trying to please different audiences. But he did say, after the bombing of Hamburg, he said another half dozen such raids would cripple Germany's war production. That's what he thought then. But this is subjective. And he later discovers that's not true. That's right. He could have been panicked. It might have been worth trying to stampede a few other people. Mention of these staunch fellows in their jackboots it compels me to say again, Speer's empire of production, which included, I think I'm right in saying, the factories that built the rocket weapons and other places, was a slave empire. These were not Germans working. Yeah. They were slaves from Russia and Poland and Yugoslavia and Greece and elsewhere. I'm in favor of the liberation of slaves, okay, whatever it takes. And I think it can be something you have to undertake in a hurry. You're certainly morally obliged to undertake it in a hurry. And those whose manpower and well-being, all the cigarettes you can get, and so on, depend upon slavery, have made a pact upon which they may be called to witness. Sorry to sound like a preacher, but there it bloody well is. And those slaves were liberated before they could be exterminated or before they could be worked to death. And I think this really must be part of what you call the calculus. So,
So I'm alerted by, if I may, I'm terribly sorry, alerted by a phrase.
We're
that
dying
Hitch
of politeness
here. Whatever it takes, that phrase that Hitch uses there. We agree.
By any means necessary is the traditional slogan.
Yeah, okay, by any means
by
necessary.
any means necessary.
And also by any means effective, I've got to say, because somebody sent me an email shortly after my book came out in the UK, a professor of economics at St Andrews University, and he said to me, I find your book incredibly interesting. I'd just like to let you know that there's quite a bit of discussion about what would have happened if the whole bombing effort of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force had been focused on industrial and military targets. If the RAF had really backed up the United States Army Air Force on this one, he said the war could have been 2 years shorter if they'd done that. That's a fantastic thought, if correct. But of course it's a post facto surmise about it. But it suggests something, which is that the area bombing, the attacks on civilian populations, were not part of what was necessary. They were not necessary to winning the war. And that, in a way, if it's if any sense attaches to the idea of potentiating the degree of moral criminality of an act, it just makes things worse. That it wasn't really having any, that it was marginal, and yet it caused this huge number of casualties.
I want to go up in the back, way up in the back on the left.
In fact, we scuppered a gentleman here because I interrupted. I'm so sorry. This gentleman here with the beard.
Well, we'll come right back. We'll come back to him next. But go up there. Yeah.
Yes, the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress houses a somewhat incredible collection of, at this point, 40,000 oral histories. And more than half of those are World War II veterans. And I have yet to hear a testimony or read a letter or a manuscript that has any compunction about the dropping of the atomic bomb. To a man, every veteran sees this as bringing a war to an end. And I think it is quite interesting to seem to have discounted that from all of our discussions. It's one thing to look at the documents and to look at the leaders. It's quite another thing to look at the opinions of the men who are expected to put their lives on the line and to actually execute that war.
Okay, but it's not unlike the huge population explosion of Jews in France during the Second World War. I mean by that to say, I'm sure you've had the same experience. Ever been to a French farmhouse that didn't shelter at least 6 Jews? I have not. There must have been a gigantic growth of Jewish population under Vichy, it seems to me. Likewise, I hate to say this, I have never met an American serviceman who was anywhere near the Pacific Theater who has not told me that on the 7th of August 1945 his regiment was scheduled to go into the home islands of Japan. They all seem to believe it. Now, I wasn't there, and I'm not one to want to quarrel with the guys in uniform, but it can't be true. And the argument was not made to them at the time, hey, we've shortened the war, you can go home. This is why we've done it. It was not made till 1947. Whereat, I believe, it was very useful, as was the opening of Buchenwald and Dachau and Neuengamme, instilling any conscience that people might have had about what they'd done. Ah, well, then now I see why it was necessary.
Well, so
I think one has to distrust this stuff very much. In other words.
Can I tell you that just before I came across the pond, I, on the same day, received a telephone call, a message on my answer phone, and a letter. And the telephone call was from an elderly gentleman who said, I'm phoning to say, I've just finished your book. I was an air crewman, I was a sergeant navigator in Royal Air Force Bomber Command. And ever since the war, I've suffered in silence the sense of terrible guilt of what we did. I felt it then, I felt it ever since. I've never really been able to articulate it. And here it is being articulated, and I'm just phoning to thank you. And I mean, to get a message like that when you've written a book is very moving. And I brushed a tear from my eye, and I opened the letter that was lying on my desk, and it said, you bastard, how can you say this about our brave men who did this, and blah, 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 and went on and on and on like that. It wasn't the only letter I got, but there are always two sides to the story. And sometimes then I think to myself, why is it that, that the person who wrote the letter, who was angry with me for having written the book, and who's all, therefore, ever since the war, the woman in question was an 82-year-old ex-Women's Auxiliary Air Force officer, in fact, who had seen the planes going off and some of them not coming back, and that's one reason why she was so angry, because she witnessed the the sacrifice from the British side of the story. Why she never had to say anything, was never called upon to justify what she was part of or what had happened, because there was a consensus about it. Whereas he felt we'd won a victory, we'd defeated a terrible enemy who had to be defeated. I was part of that. But at the same time, you know, when you read those accounts of airmen who could feel the heat from Hamburg and from Berlin and Dresden in their aircraft from 20,000 feet and see the glow from hundreds of miles away as they flew back again afterwards, who never said anything because they felt that to do it would be some kind of betrayal even of themselves. And that's one reason for silence.
Anyway, we have Group Captain Leonard Cheshire and many, many other veterans who took a different view even at the time, as well as since. So it's not, in fact, a perfect correlation between being a combatant and being an enthusiastic supporter of area bombing.
We're coming up on 9 o'clock, and I want to give time for people to, you know, either buy books outside and talk. So let me take 2 more questions and ask that they be brief and ask that the responses be brief. But you will have a chance to talk to each of them afterwards. So if we don't get to your questions,
if you have a receipt.
Yeah.
This is America.
Well done. Here and here. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Right. Sorry.
Thanks a lot. You made compelling contextual arguments against the bombing tactic, and I wanted to play devil's advocate real quick. If Germany and Japan had come across a similar capacity to do civilian bombings to the U.S. and the U.K., wouldn't it be a handicap to not be able to use the same tactic against Germany and Japan prior to them actually doing it to the U.S. and the U.K.? So if your opponent can sucker punch you, wouldn't it be wrong to not be able to sucker punch them before they did it to you?
Well, I think there's something that lies behind the question that I have to take issue with, which is that if the point in question were trying to preempt their capacity to do that to you, to do an air bombing campaign against you, that the right thing to do would be to attack that capacity, to attack their aircraft and airfields and bomb-making factories and so on. That to attack their civilians in their cities would have been entirely the wrong strategy, because it would have left unaffected their ability to do it to you. So that's my response.
E.M. Forster wrote a great essay. It's reprinted in 2 Cheers for Democracy. It was actually delivered as a BBC broadcast in the early days of the struggle, saying, and he was very anti-militarist, but he said, before we consider what Germany might do to us, we should consider what it's already done to Germany. The wreckage of German culture, the smashing of the universities, the emigration of the genius of Germany, not by any means all of it Jewish, but a lot of it, which very probably meant that they hugely retarded their ability to use physics for warfare. But we knew that they were working on it, and it's the only reason that men like Einstein, who would never have dreamt of prostituting his talent in this way, and Niels Bohr were willing to work on it too, was because of the dread that they might get it first. Well, now, if you're in a situation where you don't know, you know Heisenberg is still in Germany, you know he's a great physicist, you don't know how much resources he has, well, you have to consider yourself entitled to try anything, it seems to me. It would be irresponsible, it would be impeachable not to do so. We don't know how close they came, not very. They were defeated partly because they were fascists. Fascism is irrational and self-destructive. We can be grateful for that, like bin Ladenism.
Sir?
The problem I'm having with the moral position on this is that when you take the moral position, it's very difficult to attack it with logic. When one deals with, it's regrettable because we were enraged. It's regrettable because we wanted to send a message of revenge. It's regrettable because we wanted to make Stalin think twice. It's a very utilitarian argument. But it seems to me to posit the moral position, which is, you know, either with it or you're not, is that the deliberate targeting of civilians, whether from the air or from the ground or for torture or holding them incommunicado for years or whatever, suspension of habeas corpus, and all of these things can be done for utilitarian reasons. But it seems to me that when you take those positions and you use them, you are sailing from the shores of civilization. And there's no return. That it's very hard then to draw those lines.
So you can't think of any circumstances in which pacifism would be an immoral position?
Well, in fact, I can. But when I do that, I realize that I am creating a hole in a wall. I'm breaching the logic. I'm taking a position that may, in fact, be immoral for some other reason that I believe that overrides the situation.
Fair enough.
Anthony, do you want to?
Oh, I just make a tangential point, which is that the point of raising the moral issue at all, even if it's post facto and even if it's a long time afterwards, seems to me to actually pack much more of a punch than people realize. I mean, I wonder whether it isn't the case that some military commander somewhere, or much more to the point, some politician making a decision about going to war or doing something during the course of a war doesn't reflect what will happen in 30 or 40 years' time when some meddling philosopher comes along and says, what you did was bad, and ruins his reputation. And that might be, it probably isn't, but it might be a constraint on some people sometime. And, the hope, the struggle is, here we all are, we're in the raging seas of controversy and history, and we're trying to hold the lighted candle up as high as possible, and that's the point. Having the debate at all is one way of trying to save something back from our great endeavour to be civilized, and even in times of emergency.
And having it at the time, in London, in the press, in Parliament, in the churches.
Yeah.
And that's not terrible. Yeah. It would have been nice if the Germans were able to read that discussion. It would be very nice if they were able to have it themselves. Alas, it wasn't the nature of the enemy that we were confronting.
You have been a terrific audience. Thank you for your patience. I trust that's because...
Patience?
Well, if you let me continue. I trust that's because you found it interesting and thought-provoking and engaging, which I certainly did as well. Thank you all for coming. Both Anthony and Christopher will be outside afterwards if you'd like to speak to them further, and appreciate your being here.
Thank you. No, I'm sorry.
A.C. Grayling is a philosophy professor at Birkbeck College, University of London, and a fellow at the World Economic Forum. His book is Among the Dead Cities.